You just got to dip your screen down. I find it hard to get this on the screen, but
I know you had to like sit at an odd angle. So anyway, how's everything been going?
Yeah, good. We've got about 150 registered for today. We'll see what on odds about 120 we'll get to by about 5 past, and then we'll start.
Yeah.
So this is our it says session 7. It's actually session 8, but we've actually done 9, including the opening prayer, and we've got a youth session and the closing prayer to go. So we'll have 11 sessions altogether.
Okay.
Plus an optional extra discussion group after the closing prayer, because we were juggling whether this should be a meeting or a webinar because we like the interaction. But when we saw the numbers, we thought, nah, we'll go webinar.
Yeah.
And invite people into a conversation after the closing prayer.
Okay. And most of the people that are coming from Catholic schools, parishes, what do you know about the audience?
I think the lockdown in Melbourne has gone a long way to boost numbers. We have religious, clergy, Catholic parishioners, some consultants. You can see them in the Catholic office doing their work and listening. We've had a couple of international connections, particularly in the finance and economics area, just a guy from the Netherlands. And it's a mixture. So we've had a total of 341 individuals across those 8 sessions, but we're averaging, between 85 and 120 per session. So there's a lot of people staying with the journey or then watching the recordings later.
Right.
So Bishop Vincent's video has had 800 views afterwards, but everyone else has only had 30 to 40.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's
Claire, could you bring David into the room, please? David will come into the room. Thanks, David. Thanks, Claire. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Bernard. How are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, a very picturesque room there up in Camp Hill.
Yeah, Holland Park West, but that's actually someone else's house. I have no idea whose house it is, but it's much nicer than my messy office. I'd like to live in that house, Bernard, but I don't think I can afford it.
I just did have a moment of thinking I should have cleaned up behind me. I'm Kirsty anyway. Nice to meet you, David.
Yeah, hi, Kirsty. How are you going?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Claire, could you send Alice the link for today, please? She's lost it. Yep. So no good when our guest speakers have lost the link. Alice is on. Interesting, David. I saw Alice's profile in the Catholic Leader when she was talking about what she was doing, and then I realised she was at Thornlands where my kids went to school, and then I caught up with her a few weeks ago, and I guessed her email address from the bne.catholic.edu, and I just dropped the name in and got a strike straight away, and we started this conversation. And now this is her second presentation inside the Convocation. So who you know in circles of influence is quite significant.
Well, Kirsty, my wife was married for quite a long time, Patricia Ryan.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, director in Brisbane for 7 or 8 years, I think.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I remember her from last time I was at Caritas.
Yes, I think she's mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just doing a bit of admin here.
No worries, Bernard.
Just making sure all the links are going through.
How did Project Compassion go this year, given the lockdown and whatever? Well down? Well
down, but, all right. Not as bad as it could have been, if I'm honest, David. So I think the individual giving, about the same as usual.
Right.
But where there was a real decrease was on schools and parishes giving,
Yep.
and that was down by about 2 million or something.
Really?
So, quite substantial. But yeah, I mean, I think overall, sort of it was our best worst case scenario in terms of outcomes. So the real question is, what does it mean for next year? To be honest.
Let's hope things are more normal next year.
You hope so, yeah. But it's interesting just talking to people across parishes and other church agencies with their appeals at the moment. And, I think, parish life is probably unlikely to return in the same way to some extent. I don't want to be a sort of fatalist there, but, you know, I think people have learned a different way.
It's interesting what they're writing. I mean, I don't know if you read the tablet, but, you know, they've had sort of contradictory articles, some saying, you know, people have turned to religion during the, you know, they're streaming masses live a lot more than ever. And then others saying, well, people are going to sort of say, well, I haven't been to church for 6 months and no one died. So, you know, like, we're you know what I mean? Even our own parish, which is a fairly, you know, well-supported parish, we can take 99 people COVID safe. We're allowed to have 99 people in the church.
Right.
We're getting about 40.
Yeah, right.
People are still being cautious, but I just wonder if there's not going to be some long-term drop-off.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, the more people I talk to, the more people who actually found a real, you know, watching Mass online works for them, works in their family situation. They can do it when they want to, in their pajamas. They can, you know. So, yeah, it is going to be interesting, I think.
We've been having Mass with toast and coffee with the Jesuits from North Sydney for some months now. So
I was going to mention a few of us have done it with a few glasses of wine, but I didn't know if that was appropriate or not. To some people, that's all right, but to other people, it's like I can feel my grandparents turning in their graves.
Yeah, I can say 9 in the morning's been a bit early for the wine.
But Hi, Alice.
Yeah.
I'm Kirsty.
Hello. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
Hi, I'm David.
Hi, David. I think I might have met you before, possibly.
You might have.
Yeah. Did you still work for BC?
I did.
Yeah, you think?
Yeah, he was the big boss, Alice.
Yeah, no, I think you were the big boss, but when I was at school, like when I was a student.
Yeah, I'm very old. Yeah.
I know, it makes us all feel old.
I'm sorry.
Like Bernard's nearly as old as me, but you know.
Yeah, we know that.
He's just fitter than I am.
Yeah.
So Alice, you're at Carmel College.
Yes, okay. At the moment.
I had a bit to do with opening that school.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I have a lovely new admin building going up right now that Faye Connolly would have been envious of.
Yeah, it's huge. It's yeah, very, very big. But,
Are you a teacher, Alice?
Yes. Yeah, I teach secondary.
What do you teach?
Physics and study of religion are my two areas, but I also teach maths and science. And
that's a slightly odd combination, right?
Yeah, it tends to be that way. But I really liked both at school. Oops. So yeah, I just thought they're pretty good.
You won't be short of a job with physics, let me assure you.
I know. Yeah. There's always people looking for us. So
yeah. Now, David, Bob Cullen says you are not old.
Not compared to him.
He's not.
Bob was the area supervisor when I got the job at Opening Mary MacKillop School, and you can see that one just up there on the picture. And he was the one that chaperoned me through the interview process with the then executive director prior to David.
Oh, there you go.
And Bob's on the Sunshine Coast in Caloundra, driving things up that way around Care for Creation.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And Bob's replied, has he? No, he hasn't yet. We were going to do the meeting format, David, but registrations are up to 150, and we thought, no, we're going to create a discussion group after the closing prayer instead, because there's lots of people want to talk, and so we just restructured this, and it's probably, it's our panel. And we're hoping Leila will be on time, but no guarantee. She's a Year 12 student, and she has to bump out of classes to be here, but she's very, very keen. So Kirsty, Leila's a young lady who's chafing a bit to do an immersion somewhere and to work overseas as a gap year, and just absolutely fever pitch into this.
That's wonderful. Except we can't get anywhere. But
yeah. So
at some stage,
that's the nature of it. Yeah. Okay. So welcoming those people online, we're up to 38. If you can't see yourself, it's because we've changed it to a webinar. Because we have about 150 registrations, it's easier to manage, particularly the and able to mute everybody if we're using a webinar. And Kirsty knows that because the last time she was doing something important, I was talking on my mobile and I thought I was muted, but I wasn't.
That's right. We learnt the hard way, didn't we, Bernard?
Yeah. Well, you know, it says mute and you don't know when you press it, whether it's actually muting or whether it's not muting. Like it just says mute, so you press it, but you're unmuting yourself. So, a bit crazy. And David, a good weather up there today?
Oh, it's a bit chilly up here today. It's only 31 degrees here, Bernard.
Yeah. That's looking forward to that someday. we almost got to 30 yesterday here. It was a bit stressful.
What we're looking forward to is some rain. They keep promising us rain and it hasn't arrived yet. So.
Okay, and the dam levels, what are the dam levels doing?
Dropping down, actually. They're talking about, I think they were in the high 58s, the high 50s, and they're talking if it gets 50, they'll be bringing back restrictions, I think.
Yeah, and that's pre-summer, unless you get the spring rains and you haven't got it. Like October is usually a time of those spring rains. I remember our opening of the school at Birkdale, it always thunderstormed around about that time.
Yeah, it nearly always rained at school openings in my memory.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens that way.
We didn't have much grass either, usually. So
yeah,
the BGA didn't pay for much grass.
No, they don't pay for much grass at all.
Or concrete paving. Not in the old days, anyway.
No. It's stage one. Local government insists on having landscaping, but after that, all the landscaping is stripped out. And good morning to Karen Tucker, who sent us a good morning message, and saying hello to a few people online: Angela Bayliss, Bernard Green, Bob Wood, Catherine McAleer, Cecilia, Chelsea Coles and Chris Telford, Colleen Foley, David Tuddy. Hey, David from Toowoomba, well done. You and Catherine up there in Toowoomba. Elizabeth, Wilkenya Forbes. Also got Dennis Nicol, Francis and John Dambra down in Cronulla. Gabriel Fogarty. We've got Janice Gallos. Janice, you've been here a lot. Welcome back again. And also Joan Kennedy. Julie Buick, Kerry Stone. Hi, Kerry, back again. Kathy Lord. Lee also. Welcome back, Lee. Maria Finn. And these entries keep jumping around, so that's why I'm jumping around. Matthew Navarrete down from Melbourne Catholic Education. Hi, Matthew. Mary Tinney. Thank you for your last book, Mary. Patricia Highmarsh back online. Sandra from Ballarat, welcome. Sarah, Shirley Walsford, Simone, Sulomu. Thanks, Sue, for joining us again. Susan Crow. So just running through those names to recognise people. So we're at 67. We'll go in about a minute's time. We'll just see how we go. So Claire, maybe perhaps we go to the holding screen there. That would be good. So we worked out, Kirsty, we've got to work in tandem with these things because there's too many moving parts.
I'm so bad with technology, Bernard. Yeah, I'm impressed regardless of what happens.
Well, I worked out when I've got two screens, I'm in real trouble because I usually end up sharing the wrong one.
I did that at our board meeting yesterday, so I now know how not to do that.
Yeah, and everyone says, oh, I can see your emails.
That's right.
We might kick off, folks. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us. This is our 7th session, which is actually our 8th because we had a part A and a part B. And we'll just switch to the next slide, please, Claire. First of all, we'll just do our welcome to country. When Sherry Balcombe from Catholic Aboriginal Mission in our services in Melbourne spoke, she spoke of, for her, it had always been a special connection to country that she did not fully understand. It was something deep inside her. And she knew she was different to others, but she didn't know why. But then she realised that when she was born traditionally, she was baptised in the land with the soil of her country, and she would have animal fat rubbed on her arms and legs to make her strong and protect her. And then she'd be washed in the local river or in the waterways. So as we gather, we acknowledge the first peoples of this land that we now call Australia. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and commit ourselves to ongoing relationships and reconciliation with the land and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. May we continue to listen to and learn from the first peoples and how to truly live in harmony with creation. So folks, welcome to our journey through the season of creation. We've envisaged Catholic Earthcare as a meeting place, a people of like-minded motivations and missions, a place where we can come together to share and to learn. Not anyone's particular organisation or ownership. And now as a program of Caritas, we're now empowered a lot more to be more productive using our team of animators to engage in both social and ecological justice across the church in Australia. So journeying through our convocation at the moment, as we just mentioned about Sherry's introduction about her relationship with country, under the theme of eco-literacy, we also had Peter Saunders, formerly of Campion Spirituality, and he talked about his Walking with God program and the moment of conversion at the top of an impossible climb, looking out over the Southern Alps with his son on the majesty of creation. And we flowed on to eco-theology, and Bishop Vincent Long talking about our church that has many divergent views on what we should do. But he said we need to begin with our common ground, and that is from the Gospels, to live sustainably and to live simply. And we, in terms of the leadership, which is our focus today, he also said we can't leave the big issues for the big companies and government. As gospel-centred people, we all have a role to play. We had many presentations with deep theological presentations there from Trish Hindmarsh, Sandy Cornish and Bronwyn Lay. And we flowed on to the guts of our convocation, what really changes things, and that's money, unfortunately, but that's what speaks in our economy. Ross Garneau reinforced the message around Laudato Si, knowing personally the people who are co-architects, and reiterated there is great hope. And the feedback from our conversations so far around the convocation is there is much more hope than people have thought of in the past. Our media would not show that there's that great hope. Ross is saying that economics is telling us that Australia has a particularly enormous potential and opportunity to utilise its natural advantage in solar and wind. And in answering the question, what do we do about this? He said, show them how to do it, like I'm doing in Western Queensland. Build it and they will believe in it. Tim Buckley from IEFA reiterated that divestment is no longer the big financial issue, it's a moral one. But the overwhelming majority of all new investment is in renewables. Even Adani himself, while losing $2 billion in coal last year, made $9 billion in renewables. So while environmentalists believe we can address the environmentalists believe we can address the climate crisis, but not in time, Tim believes we can do it because that's where the money is, and money ultimately talks. And he strongly recommended go and get your 15 minutes of fame with your local politician and talk to them. And if we all do that, we start to create a whole of community change. Yen Wong and Bill Worthington talked to us about green bonds and how they can be invested in by superannuation companies in an ethical way with government guarantee. And Louise and Michael from Australian Catholic Super and Retirement explained the basis of ESG. And I come away with that one-liner from Michael that superannuation is a social justice in action. And they comfort us in the notion that while their fiduciary responsibility had to be fulfilled to ensure the best return on investment, that this increasingly meant the inclusion of responsible investment portfolios in their mix. I'm sure you'll hear more about that today as well. And so today we move to the action stage. How can we all lead our way out of the crisis? Bring our hearts together to care for our common home. Leadership, not just by a few, but leadership as a friend, as a companion on the journey, leadership as an advocate, a technician, a writer, a singer, a politician, a religious, a priest, a student. We've talked about your locus of control, what you can do and have control of every day of the week. And we've talked about your circles of influence. Who do you know? Who can you connect with? Who can you learn from? And we've talked about your areas of concern, and this is why we're here today. So today we're going to reflect on leadership and the relationships that call for an ecological conversion. Thought now we might just reflect back on the season of creation just to set the context for today. Thank you, Claire, for that first video.
God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time. With no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of light. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship so loud, I can see your heart in everything you've made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your praises so loud, so God of your promise, you don't speak in vain, no syllable empty or void. For once you have spoken, all nature and science follow the sound of your voice. And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you say. If it all reveals in nature so alive, I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky, a canvas of your grace. If creation still obeys you so loud,
Thanks, Claire. So it sets the scene today for our guest speakers. I'm not sure if Leila's online yet, but Alice, so we'll probably call on you to go first if Leila's running late. I'd like to introduce both all our speakers today, Alice and Kirsty and David. Alice is a Brisbane-based teacher and a community sustainability leader. And she's a secondary school teacher at Carmel College at Thornlands in Brisbane. And I visited her recently and her school, and some wonderful innovations going there within both the teaching process and starting in the organisation of the school. Alice is going to talk about change me, change my community. How one person inspired that whole community change. And you might have met Alice earlier in our convocation, talking specifically or across a number of topics, and she'll focus today on this community change aspect. So thank you very much, Alice, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Would you like to just tell us about how you think you can bring about whole of community change and what you've done so far?
I think when we are the biggest change agents in our communities, it's when we are role models. So when we make the decisions and the choices that are helping the environment, the ones that we actively know that are making change, and then other people see those choices and those changes that we are making, that is when we really can influence our community, even if our community is, as you say, with the circle of influences, even if our community is only this amount. Those few people then, when they make their choices and their changes, then influence their larger communities as well. So for me, that's really the biggest thing in terms of changing community, is being that role model for that change, and that I ultimately want to see in the future.
Good. Would you be able to reiterate for our audience who perhaps weren't part of the earlier sessions about Overturn the Tables?
So Overturn the Tables was a website and a Facebook page and Instagram that I've now developed in response to the ecological conversion that I underwent during Lent. So in Lent of 2018, I decided to go zero waste over 40 days. And that was a very big challenge that I undertook. And the 40 things that I decided to do over those 40 days quickly turned into over 100 things. And as I changed through that period of Lent, it really was an interchange of the heart, and Lent never ended for me. So the process that I went through, it ultimately changed my thinking. And now, as a result, I continue to be zero waste, and I continue to move forward and make changes all the time. But when I went through that, we sort of talked about, like how our thinking was changing and all those sorts of things. And I thought I really needed a place to be able to put all these ideas, all the recipes that I'm using, all the choices that I'm making, so that other people can see the reasons why I'm doing things. So it started off during Lent. I just sort of blogged about it on Facebook as I was going through. Every day I would put up something about what was going on. And people were still interested in what was happening. So then I decided to develop the website Overturn the Tables. From that, I now have schools and parishes that contact me to help them and their communities to transition through a sort of similar, not the same process, but through a similar process as well. And on Overturn the Tables, hopefully starting from next month, there'll be a program for individuals and families as well to be able to help them on that journey too.
Can you give us an example of, day 1, day 2, day 3, that whole story of conversion? I think that's really interesting.
I sat down and wrote a list. I'm a very list person. So I sat down before Lent started and I wrote my 40 things that I was going to do. And one of the first things, for example, was my compost bin. I had to go and get a compost bin of some description. We were living in a very small unit at the time, and we just needed something little that we sort of weren't, digging massive holes with and all this sort of stuff. So we just got a little compost bin from that. And other things were, I decided to get a wooden toothbrush because I needed to update my toothbrush. I made certain days on the weekends where today I'm going to make sure I try and go to the butcher with my plastic container to get it refilled, as opposed to just getting it wrapped in plastic. All those sorts of things. So I wrote down and just thought, I literally just Googled it. I said, 40 things to transition to zero waste. And some of them I already was doing, like buying from op shops and all those sorts of things. I was already doing those, so I didn't put them on my list. But as I went through, I sort of picked and chose, small, manageable things that I knew that I could achieve in that time to be able to do it. So that was the process that we went through. But as we did it, say, for example, on day 2, when I was doing my toothbrush, at the same time, I realized that my shower cap that I was using was made of plastic, and it was very quickly running out of its elastic. And I sort of researched, oh, okay, well, what can I do with this shower cap that I now don't have, but I need to keep my hair dry when I'm showering? And I just researched it, and apparently you can use an old plastic bag of some description and bobby pins, and that's now what I use. So that was an example of something that sort of popped up as we were going along to make those other small changes, and how it quickly grew from 40 to over 100 things.
So I want to take the conversation two directions. One, back into yourself as to what is that inspiration, what is the motivation? And then the second one, how are you affecting change in that way in other people? So first of all, what is really driving you in this area? What's at the heart of your conversion?
I think it's just my faith, like knowing that we are so blessed to be part of God's creation all the time. And there's so much that we have done in the past, and we hear it all the time. There's so much sadness, and there's all that, all the negative things we see, all the pollution that's occurring. And I don't want to be part of that. I don't want my footprint to be so disgusting and dirty and awful and, polluting of the environment. I want to reduce it. I want to tread lightly on the earth. So that really is my internal motivation. And I don't know whether that shines out when I'm talking to others in the community, but because it's hard to sort of show that within your heart that that's what you're trying to do. But yeah, so when I'm trying to allow others to, think differently and change their ideas and their habits, it's all about that internalness. It's all about changing of heart and going through that conversion. I do not believe that as a community we can make any changes unless we have that conversion.
And are you seeing your motivation actually maturing, your inspiration actually maturing across this journey? So you started off thinking this is the inspiration, but in actual fact it's actually journeyed?
Yeah, it has. It has changed tremendously. Originally, the focus very much was, I just need to get rid of my rubbish bin. Like that was my one drive. But then when I saw that all of these things were all linked together, like that real integral ecology that Pope Francis talks about, when I really learnt about that and saw how that was happening, everything was evolving. And even though I say I'm zero waste, it's really much more than that. And the things within my heart, like, originally it was just about, okay, we just want to get rid of our bin, and that's it. Like we just were zero wasters. But now I definitely, feel like it's a different, more mature feeling around what's happening inside. So yeah, it's hard to describe.
Yeah, and as you engage with other people, so you've talked about your mum in the past, and she saw what you're doing, but you're engaging with parishes, you're engaging with schools. What are you seeing is the point of traction with individuals?
I think when they can see that it's the choices, when we talk about in the workshops that I do and all those sorts of things, when I show them, okay, we have an opportunity every time that we make a choice. We can choose to make something better, or we can choose to just continue with all of our old habits that, are not particularly good. When we talk about that and they can see that the smaller choices, those really tiny steps that we can, make along our progress, along our journey, that's really when people say, oh yes, we can do this. It's possible. There is capacity in our parishes and in our schools to be able to make them, but it's never going to happen overnight. I think we see so many, especially like social media is the big thing about this. Like they show, all the big ideas and the big changes, and like Fight for Planet A, that show on ABC, that was brilliant. That was really great. But watching that, the entire, like they shortened that down to about 3 days or 3 episodes or whatever it was. But knowing that for those families, that would have been weeks of progress and weeks of them talking and working as a family or as a share house and that stuff. They would have had to work together to be able to do that over quite an extensive period of time. And when you present it in that 3 hours, it's like, oh yeah, everyone can do it. But they don't realize the amount of work and the amount of change that has to happen internally for that to happen. So when it comes to our big organizations and, they turn around and they say, oh, we have this really big goal of wanting to have this, certain thing, we need to break that down. we really need to get into, okay, step by step, what's going to happen.
And I had this great question in my head, you know, and it just disappeared.
Oh, sorry.
Like, you know. so tell me, we talked about what the traction is inside different individuals, and that's different for all. So you've just gone out and mentioned the larger organisations. What has been the change that you've seen in those organisations that you've engaged with?
One of the schools that I've been working with, St Eugene College at Burpengary in Brisbane, they've done tremendous work. I'm really quite surprised and amazed at how much they've done in 1 year. They dedicated the whole year to creation, and they wanted to foster a culture of gratefulness. That was what they told me when we said we want to focus on gratefulness for the whole year, and we want to link that to the environment. I said, okay, that's cool. So we did we workshopped that for the in their professional development at the beginning of the year. And since then, the students they had a whole week in the season of creation where they did different activities every day. But things like they've changed their acts of service. So in the past, normally when schools talk about acts of service, they, go out and feed the homeless, or they're fundraising for certain things. But these kids were picking up litter, and they have a lovely sort of river creek thing that's at the back, and they completely cleaned that out during the time that was in that week. And the students really understood that an act of service can also be an act of service to the environment, not just to people. So even though essentially it was just a glorified emu parade, they understood that, yes, this is actually us doing God's work. When we are picking up litter and we're putting it in the right place, that's part of our actions where we're being Jesus in our own lives. So they were doing that. They've also started a garden. They've changed some of the ways that they do their waste and all of those sorts of things. They were also looking into, I don't know how far they got, but they were also looking into fair trade uniforms. But I know that I don't know how they got in progress with that, but I know that there's other colleges that have been working along that as well. So it's so inspirational.
Thank you so much, Alison. A big shout out to Marissa Dan, who I believe is the principal up at St Eugene's. And David, you'll be pleased to know that the education brief we wrote for that school is now being followed very closely. So Kirsty's background, I wrote the education brief for that school when I was restructured from a primary to a secondary, and the ecological components to it were all embedded in the education brief. So it's lovely to see it coming through. I'd like to now introduce, thank you very much again to Alice, and please hang around for our sort of panel session. I'd like to introduce Kirsty Robertson now. Kirsty is the CEO of Caritas Australia. I've been in the job about, 12 months now, Kirsty?
12 months this week, Bernard. I've got the grey hair to prove it.
Yeah. I think I was on a plane about 12 months ago heading out of Australia. As you would have seen in Cath News today, people who monitored that, there was a new board blessed yesterday for Caritas Australia as it heads in renewed directions. Kirsty has been also CEO of Miriam McKillop today, and I'm involved in international development for many, many years. And I would like to think that Leila, who hopefully will join us, is another Kirsty in the future, because you are very passionate about, worked inside Caritas, both in international programs, as the comms officer, worked in other organisations, and now back as CEO. It's wonderful to have you on board. And Kirsty, for the audience today, Kirsty today is going to talk about mindfulness in a climate-challenged world. Thank you, Kirsty.
Yeah, thanks for that topic, Bernard. Before I start, though, can I just pick up on something that Alice was saying before? Firstly, Alice, utterly inspiring. Like, I was just listening to you, thinking you've just challenged me actually in my family about the idea of going zero waste with a 3-year-old, which I think is a challenge that we can take up in our family. But there was something that you were touching on that is really important to me about this idea of heart transformation. I take on board what you're saying, Bernard, in the introduction, that I think though as a community, if we get stuck in economic theory or political platforms or special interest group pressure sort of space, we forget that at the end of the day, this is about the future of God's creation, and our one human family. And so I was really touched by that idea of a heart transformation, because, you know, personally, I think that's what's really, what really speaks to the people that I talk to anyway, in communities across Australia, and indeed, you know, across the world. Sorry, Bennett, I've gone off script, which is fine.
I totally agree with you.
And there was something else that I was thinking about as well when you were speaking, about, look, I think this is a Catholic guilt issue to some extent for me, but I first went to Kiribati back in early 2000, and it was one of those heart transformation moments for me, I think, because, you know, I was a young development worker. I was working in Caritas' Pacific programs, and at that stage, I thought I was going to save the world. You know, I thought I was bringing solutions. I thought I was, I thought I was giving. I didn't realise actually I was receiving. And I went to Kiribati, and I stood in. There's actually a photo. I tried to find it actually because I wanted to share it, but I couldn't find it in the Caritas archives. But I'm in knee-deep water, and a king tide. The king tides are getting bigger and bigger in Kiribati and across the Pacific. And I was stood in that knee-deep water, and it was the site of a Caritas project. It was where a community project had existed previously, and it was the project I was supposed to be there to monitor. And for me, that was a real moment of first of all, this is real. You know, at this stage, the wider Australian community, and indeed the Catholic community, didn't want to talk about climate change. And yet here I was standing in knee-deep water going, something is going on. And for me, it was a moment of realising I was here to listen. And that has been my real journey in this, and a journey that's, you know, obviously led me into a leadership team position, but that actually communities throughout the world saw this well before we ever did in Australia, experienced this well before we ever did in Australia, and have been finding solutions to this well before we even started discussing it in Australia. And there's a great deal that we can learn from them. Alice, again, you spoke about gratitude, and people who work at Caritas who may be on this call know it's something that I'm pretty passionate about. But in the Pacific Islanders have a really strong sense of the earth as a gift, and the earth as something that needs to be cared for every single day. It's not an afterthought. It's not something that you overlay on your life. And that's something that we see in our programs at Caritas throughout the world, actually, this idea that the earth is a gift, because the communities we work with are often much more connected to the earth, to where their food supply comes from, than we are. And so, you know, yes, science and policy are leading or have led the response to environmental concerns for decades. But actually, I think who's leading this is many of the poorest and most vulnerable communities throughout the world, who have already done phenomenal adaptation projects, amazing mitigation projects. And I think there's a lot that we could learn by listening to them about what they're doing in their communities. Another thing I was thinking of when you were talking, Alice, was in PNG we have this amazing project over the last year where we've been working in schools doing sort of multimedia training. So essentially encouraging youth in PNG to be advocates for climate-related issues, and now they're advocates for COVID related issues as well. And you know, the students learn about effective public messaging, about transforming hearts and minds in their own communities, and they've come up with these amazing little jingles that run on television and on radio throughout PNG. But when we read the monitoring reports and, you know, the evaluations of those projects, what people describe is exactly what Alice just described, which is this is less about the really big picture. This is more about their sphere of influence. And the sudden realization for these young people in PNG that their sphere of influence is actually quite large. You know, if you take into account their communities, their schools, their parishes, they have a reasonable size sphere of influence as well. And so what we're hearing from youth in these countries is the same thing I think we're starting to hear from youth here in Australia, which is, you know, this is amazing. We can make a difference. People will change their actions and be inspired by us. One other thing I was thinking about when I was reflecting on the topic, I don't know if Bernard was having a joke when he gave me a topic called mindfulness, because I'm a sort of person who's always got 400 things going on at once. And one thing I'm not very good at is, you know, standing still. But I heard from one of the commissioners as part of the Royal Commission that he wished that the church had just taken a moment at every single decision and said, what does this mean for the most vulnerable among us? And when I heard that speech, I subsequently, and I have one here, but I've got them literally sitting on every single computer that I work on. And this sounds ridiculous that my leadership is based on a post-it note, but this is literally what guides me in my decision making is these post-it notes that sit on my devices. And this one says, what does this mean for the most vulnerable? You know, as a really tangent reminder, a really, you know, strong reminder for me that every single decision I make, I need to keep the poorest and most vulnerable at the centre of my decision making. Because I do have power, I do have agency, I do have reasonable influence, and all of us do. And I think that's what Alice was explaining, all of us, you know, do. So imagine, like seriously, imagine the world we could live in if all of our decisions kept the poorest and most vulnerable, kept the earth and all of God's creation at the centre of our decision making. And that's, you know, that's the kind of exciting thing in COVID, if I want to talk about an exciting thing of COVID, you know, okay, yes, obviously, massive challenge, massive health and social and economic challenge, but a real opportunity to say, hey, what could the world look like if we want to grow back, not into what was before, but into what we might want to become? And, you know, I'm hearing these messages from communities all throughout the world who are beginning to reimagine what that future might look like. And I think it's pretty exciting for us here in Australia to be listening to those stories and to those voices, and to be inspired to change ourselves and the world that we live in. So yeah, I guess look, the main you know messages for me are around this idea of listening, of being really aware of the fact that that many of the poorest and most marginalised communities in the world have a great deal to teach us about the way forward in caring for God's creation.
Thank you, Kirsty. That was great mindfulness.
I was tempted just to say nothing and say maybe we should sit and reflect and be mindful for a while, but I'm not very good at saying nothing.
But in leadership talk, what you're really saying is, as leaders, we need to be mission focused, and that mission has to underwrite everything that we do.
Definitely, you know, and I think, you know, I think it's for everyone, you know, not, you know, people who necessarily have a leadership title. You know, this is a call, you know, I think Laudato Si is a call for everyone to be a leader, and a real opportunity for everyone to be a leader. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people like Alice and people in our communities all over Australia and the world take leadership in this.
Quick question. I had a phone call yesterday from a parishioner in Drummoyne completely and utterly frustrated that the parish wasn't doing anything in the Laudato Si space. And she just met one of the deacons who had just become a priest on Saturday at the cathedral, or Sunday, and she was passing on a message that please, in your ministry, be focused on Laudato Si. Do you have a sense of this schism in the church between ministry and the actual good works of social justice and ecological justice, even though they are supposed to be the same?
Good question, Vernon. I think for me they are the same. You can't hear the gospel message and in any way divide this idea of being a pious Catholic Christian and not hear the message of justice. So for me, it's impossible to see the divide. I think where there is a divide, and this is part of actually my daily conversation at the moment, is this idea that we can separate humanity, that we can separate people from the earth. And, this is part of a constant questioning I'm getting at the moment as people begin to struggle a little bit within the church, but also within the wider community about that understanding of a holistic approach here in service to all of God's creation. I was at the Caritas Australia board meeting yesterday, and that was a long conversation with Bishop Long and others, exploring what does that mean for organisations like Caritas and others that have typically been in service to the world's poor and vulnerable. What does this call to see the whole of God's creation mean for us?
Yeah. Sorry about the challenging question, but it's actually one of the most often asked questions that we get in this space from parishioners, particularly who are frustrated with lack of action, and of course they score themselves from high-end activists to really passive, and they hope that they're somewhere in between, but of course they feel misread by a lot of the people that they talk to.
Yeah, I personally think Caritas and organisations like Caritas are the church's expression of justice and commitment to Laudato Si. And, the 60,000 Australians who donated to Caritas last year and the additional 100,000 that volunteered for us or offered some other level of service, that's an example of the, sheer volume of people who are really passionate about this call. That's the church. Not the church with walls.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kirsty, and I really appreciate your input today. Don't forget, everyone, we can ask questions online. In fact, I have another little question now coming in through, but I'll come back to you later on that one, Alice. It's one for you. I'd like to introduce David Hutton. David is the chair of Australian Catholic Superannuation Retirement Fund, former executive director from Brisbane Catholic Education, and has been a superb boss for me in the past, and has many qualifications, too numerous to actually mentioned. Thank you, David. And David, you would have noticed I'm actually moving up in seniority through to you, and I know you'd appreciate that.
I know, and David, I didn't get called a superb boss, so we'll talk about that later, Bernard.
I'm sure your time will come, Kirsty. I'm sure your time will come. Well, thanks, Bernard, for that introduction. Well, as Bernard said, in some senses, I've had two careers, most of it in Catholic education, in leadership, and currently now in a number of roles, including the Australian Catholic Super in governance, I guess. The common factor is that they've got a church connection and also fairly strong education connection in pretty much everything I do. Look, I heard Kirsty, and I'm a great supporter of what Caritas does on the ground, and always been in awe of its very strong commitment to long-term development, and also in awe of what Alice is doing on a personal level and in sharing her experiences in the education space. I guess what I'll be talking about a little bit is probably a slightly bigger picture around formal leadership and roles and systems. So I'm probably just trying to, obviously both are important, both are very important and overlap. So what I thought I'd talk about firstly, some general principles around leadership, or some general discussion around leadership, some of which is just generic, but probably important for us to take on board. And then I'd like to share two more practical stories, perhaps one from education and one from the finance area. So look, as I said, leadership, some of this is the bleeding obvious, so, you know, bear with me. I mean, firstly, it's pretty obvious if you haven't got support from the top, local initiative is not going to work either. I mean, it'd be stymied. You need policies, you need structures, and you also need culture change. That is going to mean that the people at the top of the organisation, and I know that's very hierarchical language, but we have formal roles, and those people at the top of the organisation are pretty good at controlling the resources that you get. And if you don't get the resources that you need, it's not going to happen. All the goodwill in the world is not enough. The reality is we have to be very practical. There's an old saying I use a lot, is that where you put your time and your money is a pretty good indication of what your values and your vision is. If whether that's true individually, it's also true organisationally. So it's important that time and money and resources are committed to whatever it is you're trying to do. My other significant point about leadership always is that we don't operate in a vacuum. I often tell that old joke about the tourist driving around Ireland who gets lost and says to the, pulls up to the farmer on the side of the road in the back blocks of Ireland somewhere and says, I'm sorry, I'm lost, could you tell me the way to Dublin? And the farmer looks at him, casts his eye over him and says, well, if I was going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. So the reality, of course, is we are always starting from here. We're not starting from where we would like to be. So context is terribly important in any role. And I think it's naive not to think that we have to pay attention to context. And there's been some references to that already. We live in a fairly polarised world. We've had a pretty good example of that yesterday, I think, with the federal government's telling us that, you know, we're going to have a gas-led recovery, which is pretty much against all the conventional majority advice around environment and climate change. Sadly, it's not always true. It's certainly true here. It's probably true in the US. My understanding is it's not as polarised in some other countries. For instance, I gather the British Conservatives, interestingly, actually are doing some very good stuff and some strong commitments in the area of climate change and the environment. But we do live in a politically and socially polarised society. And the reality is, similarly in church, and there was some reference to that earlier, I think, that even within the church, there are some people who are still struggling to understand the holistic or the organic or the interconnected nature of what the Pope is talking about. You know, there's no doubt some of them think he's a communist and that he's lost the plot with all this sort of lefty talk. But as we heard earlier, clearly the Pope sees the connection, the connection between faith, spirituality, commitment to the marginalised and the environment. They're not for him separate issues. And I think that's the vision we've got to keep trying to promote, even within the church. And of course, there's a certain anti-intellectualism around both what's going on in society and in elements of the church, the sort of anti-science stuff that's going around. It's great to see Alice with us today. Alice, who's a science teacher and is also very committed to both her faith and to working in the area of the environment. So I think the other thing is, so we're living with this polarisation. We also live with certain tensions within that. It's interesting, even Catholic social teaching has some inbuilt tensions to it. To me, I mean, as we know, Catholic social teaching is derived. It's not you don't open a book and find here are the 10 principles. You can find books that say that, but they're actually drawn from well over 100 years of papal teaching and church teaching. Elements like the importance of human dignity and subsidiarity, in some senses, both push things down, as it were, and common good and solidarity push things up. And you're trying to find often the sweet spot in when you're looking at any particular issue. around how you bring those principles together. In an ideal world, it's creative tension, and it leads to something very positive. But at times, like subsidiarity at its worst can mean go away and leave us alone to let us do what we like. And common good can mean be quiet and just join it because the most of us think this. So you're trying to find these sweet spots in any particular issue, including issues around the environment, about how you bring these things together. They aren't necessarily always opposed. I'm not suggesting that, but sometimes they are, and people often use them or misuse them. It's a bit like proof texting out of scripture. You can, rather than looking at the whole big panorama and saying, how does this all work together? People are often keen to pick up on one or two things and then use those for their own purposes. It's interesting, I guess that's why from a spiritual tradition, we talk about the importance of a discernment in the Christian spiritual tradition. And as St. Ignatius Loyola, who was one of the masters of discernment, said, it's about finding the greater good. Most of our choices are not between things that are clearly bad and clearly good. Sometimes they are, but often it's much more complex than that. And so we're trying to work out where the greater good is. And that's where reflection, spirituality, prayer, all of that comes into what we're doing. So what I'm saying is, too, is while recognising the context, recognising the tensions, we do need to move forward. And people have already alluded to this using the term spheres of influence. One of the phrases that's always stuck with me, those of us of a certain generation might remember Action for World Development from the 70s and 80s. And their great saying was, you know, think globally, act locally. And I mean, that's what I'm hearing here too. So we do need to keep talking about at system level, at state level, at federal level, global level, church levels. We've got to keep talking about change. We've got to keep the dialogue going. The Pope's very big on that term dialogue. At the same time, it's about acting locally and making a difference. And we've already heard some great examples of that from Kirsty and Alice today. So look, let me move to the education areas where I spent, and this is where Bernard and I will do a little bit of mutual admiration here. Bernard and I worked together at the Brisbane Catholic Education Office for quite some years, and I give Bernard most of the credit for this. Back in 2007, 2006-07, Bernard was working, interestingly, in our planning and building area at that time after having his career as a principal. But he wasn't out there with hammer and pieces of timber. He was actually helping us design, build communities in new areas. We had a lot of growth in the southeast Queensland area during that time. And Bernard raised the issue of needing to start to pay much more attention to environmental issues. And really there's two, and I noticed we're celebrating the 5-year anniversary of Laudato Si. The Castry for Integral Human Development has put out a plan with a number of points, and they've identified schools and educational institutions as one of the key areas where we should be taking forward the whole Laudato Si agenda. And really there's sort of two interrelated arms, I guess. One, I guess I'd say in church terms, we talk about word and witness. The word thing is what we teach. And so it's what's going on in classrooms, I think we've moved well beyond seeing it as something that's restricted to a small unit of the religious education curriculum or wherever. It's seeing how we can integrate it across the board, particularly I think in the current climate, the last few years of the anti-science area, we've got to show people that faith and reason come together, and that we can the issues of as we were talking about earlier, spirituality and faith can mesh together and be integrated with an intelligent understanding of science. In fact, perhaps that's more critical than ever, because so many people, I think, see that if you're either a science person or you're a faith person, and they can't see the connection. And I think we have a special challenge there in Catholic education in particular at all levels to show the connectedness of those two. So schools need to be teaching that across the board. They need to show that they can develop a spirituality that is about being connected to the earth and nature, and seeing how all that fits together. We need to teach what the Pope is teaching. And then, of course, we have to actually, the witness part is actually showing that we're doing something about it. And again, Bernard had a lot to do with this in terms of starting to look at building design, issues around energy, here in Queensland, particularly cooling, those passive cooling, recycling, use of waste, water conservation, all of those sorts of things. So we've got to be sure in education that it's both do as I say, but it's also do as I do, so that there's no seen to be any, well, we're modelling it. We're modelling it both in what we say and what we teach, and also what the students see around us. So that's the education one. And so Brisbane, again, and Bernard was key to this, we established a program called Creation We Care back in 2007, which was encouraging schools to look at both their curriculum and what was being taught, and also what they were doing in terms of environmentally positive practices in the schools. And to my knowledge, that's flowered to some, to a large extent. Issues I know there's been in recent years in Brisbane. And I should mention there's plenty of other Catholic education officers and schools in the country. I think Bernard, you mentioned Trish Hindmarsh is with us today, and she was on one of your earlier sessions. I know Trish has been a leader in the whole promotion of ecological education from way back, long before anyone much was talking about it. So Trish has done fantastic work in that area, including her time as Director of Catholic Education in Tasmania, and her still writing. Sorry, there's a little bit of noise outside. We've got renovations going on at the neighbours. So they're going to get a nice house. Unlike this one, I just want to point out, this is not really my house. This is just a picture I found on the internet, so you didn't have to look at my messy office. Now the dog is going to bark. Sorry about that. So look, the last part is just to talk about my life in the last few years, which is around the superannuation industry. And I think all major financial institutions have been on a journey there. Last week you heard from Louise Bradshaw and Michael Block, who are investment experts. Louise is the ESG officer from Australian Catholic Super. I think we're on the journey, and we have been on the journey for some years. With Louise coming with us last year, we're on a new stage of that journey, and we've ramped it up well and truly. I think in the past the questions would have been around, well, to what extent how much investment outcome are you prepared to lose if you're going to be environmentally aware and committed? Whereas I think we've moved on from that a little bit. I mean, Bernard, you made reference to Adani now making more money out of renewables than it does out of coal. I don't think most Queenslanders would know that. So there is an increasing focus on ESG practices when you have some of the largest investment houses in the world saying we've got to get out of fossil fuels, we've got to look to renewables. Far more interest in ESG, the triple bottom line, environmental, social governance. So I think it's interesting though that by law, superannuation funds have what's called a sole purpose test. Our sole purpose is to get money for people in retirement. By law, that's our test. I mean, we're allowed to do insurance as well. That's a little side thing, but basically it's about delivering dollars for people at retirement. And we get regularly asked by the regulators, excuse that pun, but we get regularly asked by the regulators, how are you doing that? Are you doing that? And the ratings houses continue to push league tables of investment returns and whatever else, which focuses those of us who are involved in the industry on the dollar bottom line. The question then becomes, to what extent can we look at the other things? Because certainly some of our members are now starting to ask a lot more questions around, where is my money? How are you investing it? But I think as the industry is shifting, probably the opposition between returns and being environmentally responsible is not as pointed as it once was. In fact, interestingly, our socially responsible option last year was one of our best performing investment portfolios. So the sort of things, just quickly, that we have to think about, well, you have to think about what you invest in. Are there things that you can invest in that are socially responsible? Could it be, social housing? Could it be, renewable energy? So there's decisions about what to invest in, and there's also decisions about what not to invest in. in terms of divestment. Divestment's a tricky one. Divestment meaning, for instance, there are some things that would be very clearly, you would say, we don't want to be in tobacco, for instance. You cannot in any way say that it's responsible to be investing in tobacco. Question would be, do you just get out of any company that invests in fossil fuels because we don't think fossil fuels are the future? We're responsible. Well, one of the things you have to be somewhat aware of is you can actually, by sticking with that company and exercising your voting rights, what we call proxy voting rights, you can actually sometimes make a difference to that company. You can push them in a certain direction. So there's a bit of discernment has to go on there with some types of investments as to whether they are in fact, you're better off hanging in and trying to make a change. And certainly with, as I said, with our ramping up of our ESG awareness and our having an internal full-time ESG person, Louise has assisted us to work through various agencies that specialise in this work, in analysing analysing the companies, what they're doing, and giving us advice around whether we should be either getting out or whether we should be using our votes along with a lot of other people to make a difference to the policies that these companies are operating in. So look, we've recently, as I said, ramped up. Well, I wouldn't say in our case, from a governance point of view, we are heavily committed, but we've still got a fair way to go. But we're using the consultants we have available to us. We're analysing in much more detail where our money's going. As a $9.5 billion fund, we're not massive. We're a medium-sized fund, and some of you may know we're about to merge with NGS Super, which will take us to 21 billion. We'll probably still only be medium-sized. We don't directly invest in a lot of things. We invest through managers. So we need to filter through our managers and see exactly what they are investing in. So we can have a couple of hundred managers who are investing in many thousands of different companies or infrastructure projects or whatever. So it's a matter of being able to filter through that and to see what we can actually make. What's our sphere of influence as a medium-sized super fund? So look, there's two examples, I guess, of issues that have entertained my mind over the last 10 or 15 years, Bernard. Can't hear you, Bernard.
Helps if I come off mute, doesn't it? What actually drives you at the heart? We've talked about this formation of the heart. What's still driving you in this direction? Because I mean, you are largely responsible for that that initiative too, and you supported the movement of into creation and care in Brisbane Cath Ed. What is at your heart in this area?
Yeah, I was talking about Catholic social teaching before, and importance. I suppose to me, to some extent, what we have is a loss of an understanding of common good in the world. I think it's shifting much back more to a what's in it for me model. And so I suppose when I used to go out and speak to Year 12 graduations at schools, on the occasions I got to be a guest speaker. I think they've just about got rid of guest speakers at Year 12 awards nights, which is probably not a bad idea. But when I went out to them, you know, I basically said, this is not about you. This is not just about you. Yes, it is about you. Congratulations, you've done well at school, you're graduating. I wish you every best wish. What difference are you going to make? And to me, from the point of view, I mean, I think the test of any spirituality, a lot of people see spirituality as some sort of activity I engage in to get a warm inner glow for myself. And I think really the test of any spirituality, any Christian spirituality, is does it move you out from yourself towards others to make a difference? So to me, it's really about what difference can I make individually, corporately, and in terms of my leadership. I guess that's always been at the heart of it. And I think it's promoting a sense within people that they need to be committed to the common good. They need to be people of solidarity. Because I think the shift if there's a continuum between that individualism and the dignity of the individual and that creative tension I was talking about, to me, it's shifted back to the individual a bit. I mean, it's interesting when we vote, and I thought it was pretty obvious in the last federal election, without going into too much detail. I think for many people, the question was, what's in it for me, rather than what's best for the nation. And I think, you know, for us as Catholic Christians committed to social justice, then it is very much about what difference can I make? How can I be a person of solidarity and common good?
Oh, good. Thank you very much, David. We might just go now to our panel session. And to start that panel session off, we just have a short message from Pope Francis, which touches on what Kirsty talked about, that post-COVID world and the choices that we have. Thank you, Claire. If we could switch over to that short video.
Noi stiamo vivendo una crisi. La pandemia ci ha messo tutti in crisi, ma ricordatevi, da una crisi non si può essere uguali. O usciamo migliori o usciamo peggiori. Dopo la crisi continueremo con questo sistema economico di ingiustizia sociale e di disprezzo per la cura dell'ambiente, del creato, della casa comune. Possano le comunità cristiane del XXI secolo recuperare questa realtà, cura del creato e la giustizia sociale. Vanno insieme, dando così testimonianza della resurrezione del Signore.
Thank you, Claire. The question is, we have a choice post-COVID to continue this economic situation that we have. What's our preferred future? And David touched on the common good. I'm just, Alice, from your point of view as a younger person dealing with youth every day of the week, what's the sentiment or messaging? Is there any realization or acknowledgement of our current situation and what a post-COVID world could look like? Or is it the same old, same old?
I think it has changed. I think a lot of people, I'm currently staying at my parents-in-law's at the moment because our house is being painted and my parents-in-laws are both working at home at the moment while I'm on school holidays, and they both said that in this new time where they are working from home 2 or 3 days a week, whatever it is, their entire lifestyle has changed as a result of that. They have more time to be able to invest in like in their interests and things like that. They're very crafty people. They like to do art and gardening and those types of things. They have more time to be able to go outside and walk. They have more time to be able to cook and home make things and all of those sorts of things. And from like in my experiences, all of those sorts of things, they don't sound like, you know, they're big game changers in terms of helping the environment. But if that's happening for every single person or every single worker, or even 50% of your working population who aren't having to get into a car and drive into the city every single day, that does add up and that does have a big impact. And I know that for them, they're definitely looking at, okay, well, moving forward in their work, they're able to make the choices about are they going to continue with part-time being at home and part-time going into the office, or are they not making those changes and going to keep going in all of that sort of stuff? And both of them have said that no, they want to stay at home where they can be closer to the family and all of those sorts of things as well. So I think that whole vision of the new world of being able to be at home more and all of those sorts of things, that is really what young people are looking forward to. I like speaking with my year 12s and all those sorts of things, they're looking forward to the online education that they're going to get from their universities, because they know that they'll be able to be more flexible in their timetables, they'll be able to multitask, and they'll be able to do things like craft and gardens and all that sort of thing in their own times as well, which is different to what maybe they, even what I went through when I was at university, having to go in all the time to lectures and all of those sorts of things. Our young people as well, also, they're asking a lot of questions around like they are asking the questions about money. They're asking questions about how the economy is going to change and all that sort of stuff. And even to the point where I know some of my students are asking about which careers are we going to be going into that are going to be more suited towards this new, the area that we're in at the moment. A lot of them are, like as a physics teacher, I see all the students who want to go into engineering. Like if you want to be an engineer, you sort of have to do physics at high school, and that's the bottom line. So, you know, we often have talks about, okay, well, what type of engineering are you interested in the future? And they'll tell me, oh, you know, I want to go into this, or I want to go into mining, or whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, think about what that's going to look like for you, knowing that, you know, 10 years into the future, maybe that whole industry might be declining, or, you know, what does that sort of look like in terms of your time? Like for a lot of my friends that have done mining and all those sorts of things, they're FIFO and all of those sorts of things, like those types of choices that they're making, they don't realize that that's what's possibly in their future. And having those conversations, they're not necessarily changing their minds about, you know, the decisions that they're making as young people, but they're making them think more critically about what their life is going to look like in the future. So yeah, I think they have a lot to make choices about, and they're not as informed as I think they are as well.
Thank you. Kirsty, we were speaking the other day, and I think you briefly mentioned about different lifestyles that are happening even within the Caritas workplace at the moment based on what's happening around COVID. I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment a little bit further this post-COVID environment and what opportunities that opens up in terms of caring for our earth, but also dealing still with work as normal, if there is a normal.
That's right, the new normal, right?
Yeah.
You know, I was just listening to Alice about this idea of choice in returning to work and these flexible work practices. And I think we have to remember, pre-COVID, if anyone asked me, could Caritas Australia have all of our workforces, and this is, you know, we're in 8 countries in the world, Caritas Australia has offices, you know, could we have imagined that people could do their work from home? And I would have been one of the cynics that would have said, no, impossible. But what do we learn? And I think we learned this across most of our sector is, of course, it's possible. And for us at Caritas, where most of our workforce are, you know, predominantly driven by the mission, we found ourselves in an odd situation. And the situation was this: not that people weren't working their hours or as much as we thought they would, but that people were overworking. And, you know, that has been the real challenge for us organisationally. And as I talk to people across our sector and the church more broadly, I think that has been the COVID experience. It has triggered in people a real passion, an even deeper commitment to justice and to service. And the result in an organisation is concern over people's well-being, that people are working too hard at this time. But I don't want to say it's all pretty and all nice, because, and Bernard, you and I have similar personalities, so we know this. You know, I think there is something lost in remote working. There is something genuinely lost in a lack of connection with your co-workers. And for many people in the workplace, their colleagues are more than colleagues. You know, that is where they find their sense of community, their home. And we have to be careful about being open and able to recreate those places of connection for people, because I think the isolation is a real concern for us at Caritas, but for workplaces across Australia and indeed the world. Yeah.
David, I do have a question from you coming from Kathy Lord, but I'm just wondering if you wanted to add anything to that previous conversation.
Yeah, well, I think there's a big picture issue around, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, if we talk about, most people seem to be okay with accepting the lockdown type prescriptions. I mean, we've had these protests from a what are probably a relatively small number of people that have got a fair bit of media exposure. But there's an issue there that I think most people are committed to common good, because this is something that does require people to actually, it's, for instance, if I'm a 25-year-old and I get COVID, I'm highly unlikely to have a severe case. But if I'm 85-year-old, I will. So I think people have basically, most people have taken on board that I need to be responsible even if I'm of a younger age group, because I don't want grandma to get it or granddad to get it or whatever. So I think most people, it's had an interesting one. I hope it's not just a reaction out of fear. I don't want to get it. I hope it's actually much, I mean, none of us want to get it, but certainly I think there's also a sense that we have to be responsible for others in all of this. So maybe there's some rethinking going on in people's minds about communal responsibility, common good, etc. Just Kirsty's point's a good one. I think it's interesting. Certainly my carbon footprint has dropped back pretty dramatically since March. I haven't been on a plane since March, and I'm probably on a plane 2 or 3 times a month, and certainly haven't driven anywhere much. But I do think, yes, the remote models like this, Zoom and Teams and Skype and whatever else, we are going to rethink how we do business. But I do think Kirsty's last point is a really important one. I was talking to some of the people I'm with 6 months down the track. Initially, we thought, yeah, this is good. Why didn't we do this earlier? It works really well. Now we're missing that face-to-face contact, and we're missing, the more informal thing you can have on a face-to-face, where you chat to someone over coffee. So you say, Kirsty, how's the family? Or you might even ask some sort of business-related question that you've been meaning to talk about offline a bit. I think we're starting to miss that, and it will be difficult if new people come into groups and they don't have the chance to meet and engage with people on a face-to-face basis over coffee or a bite of lunch or, etc. So I think, yes, it will change. Hopefully it will have some positive environmental impacts. People will travel less. But I think we have to, I think in an ideal world, it'll end up being a mixed operation. And again, as Kirsty said, a little bit depends on personality too. I think the introvert versus extrovert, all of those sorts of things come into play a bit. I mean, we saw that with online learning with kids, I think, that there were some children who thrived on online and some kids just could not make it work for them at all. And so I think, a lot depends on personality too. So probably the answer is it's going to be mixed into the future, but I think certainly it will change the way we work.
And there's a question there from Kathy Lord about just acknowledging the great things happening in schools around teaching of Laudato Si, but there's a dichotomy between that and the Catholic parish, especially where clericalism reigns. She refers to your comment about support from the top of the organisation is important. Do you have any thoughts on parish situations in this situation? How can one work with this milieu?
I think that's a $64 million question, that one. And not just about this issue in parishes, but, the Pope talks about the scourge of clericalism regularly. But I don't actually see a lot of practical changes that will actually, as we said earlier, if you actually want to make change in an organisation, you can't separate out a change of culture from policy, structures, practices. They've got to both come together. And I hear a lot of talk from bishops about change of culture, but I don't actually see much in change of actual practice. As long as we have a fairly hierarchical church with an understanding of priesthood particularly, and bishops as well, that is based on this concept of ontological change, we've got a real problem theologically there. And I know that some people will be horrified at my saying that, but the reality is we have a theology around priesthood and bishops, which is then enshrined in canon law, which makes it very difficult to actually change some of the practices and for clericalism to really, I think we haven't really made inroads into this whole issue of clericalism. The Pope can talk about it, but in reality, we rely on the grace and favour of bishops and priests to work with the laity in a genuinely collaborative way. I think the the terminology probably now is more about co-responsibility. I think Pope Benedict used that term, and I think that rather than collaboration can be a little bit patronising in some ways, if it's not, particularly if it's not genuine. But the reality is that lay people pretty much only have what's called a consultative role in church life, and that's, at this stage, that's still pretty token. So coming back to the question about parishes, well, again, it does rely on an enormous amount on the leadership in the parish. There can be good lay leadership, someone who's got some energy and convinced, but again, it's very much at the grace and favour of the priest as to whether that something will happen at that level. I mean, there certainly are parishes that have formed either as part of social justice groups or as separate groups, action groups that have worked with the Laudato Si, developed action plans, looked at the parish. Bernard, you'd probably have a better sense of how many there are. I suspect it's not a lot. And the other thing, as I said, we hear a lot, I mean, Caritas and Catholic Earthcare are official agencies of the bishops. So there is certainly at a senior level a support for social justice, for development and its connections to the environment. But how far it filters down, I think it's really hit and miss. I don't know there is any easy answer to that. It's part of a much bigger issue around clericalism.
Probably for our audience's awareness is that Catholic Earthcare, now powered by Caritas Australia, has developed and animate a program by which we're trying to bring to life the Caritas story in parishes and schools. And as part of that, continue the Catholic Earthcare push to establish Laudato Si steering committees in each diocese, if not at parish level. And for those parishes who don't have one, that the interested parishioners join other interested parishioners and come together. So Catholic Social Services in Victoria 2 years ago initiated a gathering of interested parishes in Box Hill, and then last year in Brunswick, and it brought in interested parishes and interested parishioners, and it started to grow. Then through the Holy Queen of Apostles at Stafford and certainly Brackenridge, the clergy there are very supportive, and we had a similar gathering in those spaces, and all of a sudden you start to get this interest. Parishioners who are not in a Laudato Si committee in the parish ask questions, and they start to join not so much other parishes, but certainly link into those groups, so they feel as though they're doing something positive. When we tried to do that in Sydney, we got surrounded by 3 dioceses. We got 3 parishes, and it just didn't work. But we learnt more about that failure than success. The second thing is we're trying to link all these diocesan and archdiocesan committees together with a teleconference just twice a year, sharing what you're doing in this space. And I think, David, you're right. I think that social justice committees are in about 5% of the parishes, and Laudato Si committees like 1 or 2%, according to some vicar generals that told me that. So it's not a huge footprint. So to me, if we rely on our own parish in this space and it's not working, we need to link across our church and bring our church together across parishes, across dioceses, to have a shared conversation. And that's where Catholic Earthcare has been pushed in terms of a place to meet and a place to share and a place to learn. And following from there is the Catholic Earthcare Schools program. Let's try to do that in the schools program, replicating Creation with Care, David, in Cyprus BCE. I'm just thinking, is there any other comments people would like to make themselves from the panel there? I've got a few questions there, but it's not really following our train of thought. I wanted to come to you with one last one, and that is, if there's one action you could do currently in your current role, what is it to advance this story of care for creation? And perhaps we go to Alice first.
I need a minute to think.
Okay.
Do you want me to go, Bernard?
Kirsty. Yep.
Hi, Alice, thanks. Look, I think for me anyway, in my current role, we're currently looking at a 10-year strategic plan for Caritas. And so, I think organisationally, when we develop these guiding documents, that is the moment at which we can embed, enshrine these sorts of principles and these sorts of actions that we were talking about today. You know, then it needs to be in the words, and then we need to see the action coming out of that. But I certainly think, and David touched on it before, you know, your mission document of your organisation is actually through your budget. You can see where you spend your money, where you put your strategic intent, and for a leader of any organisation, I think making it clear in our strategic plan is really really a core part of my role. Then just secondly, I think one thing, you know, the pandemic is deepening pre-existing inequalities. Those inequalities already exist. It's exposing vulnerabilities in people. So I think it's really important for all of us to never lose sight of the fact that we can make a huge difference in the world. And we just heard Alice talk about it before. And I think it's really easy to get stuck in a little bit of a disempowered cycle. And what's really important to note is, like, you know, every single one of us can do one tiny action, and it can make a massive, massive difference in the world, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Thank you, Kirsty. Alice, how are you going?
Yeah, I'm all good. I think it's because, you know, I sort of have two roles. I have my role as a teacher, and then I also have my role going and working with schools. So I suppose in my role as a teacher, I'm always striving to be that better role model for my students. But I think, you know, in a school that I'm at where there's 1,400 students, I only see 200 maybe, depending on the given day. So I think in my own school, I need to have that bigger push towards things like the Laudato Si committees and all of those sorts of things, and dedicating more time towards that. But in terms of my role with my business, I think one of the things that I definitely need to work towards is making sure that when I'm helping these groups, like whether they're a Laudato Si committee or they're a youth group, or whether it's the whole staff of a school, the leadership teams need to be there when I'm going through that, because it's all good if I have everyone on board, but then they're not. At the same time, like what David was saying about the clericalism, like Father Morgan Batt down in Burleigh Heads, he is one of the most dedicated people to Laudato Si and also social justice that I think I've ever seen. But he leads that entire program within his parish. He is the one that does all that, and he's father, like he is their head honcho. So I think, yeah, if I can bring those people to that conversation more, then that would, I think, hopefully have a bit of a better impact.
That's great. Thanks, Alice. And David, the final say? Need to unmute. Sorry,
the dog was barking. What would I do? I think my primary role at the moment is with the super fund, and I think certainly I'm very keen that we take forward the whole ESG area, and particularly as we're about to merge and bulk up. I just noticed one of the questions there is around what can super funds do? Well, there is a question about how often we can. Sorry, a bit of background noise. Sorry.
We could answer the question for the neighbour.
The plumber has arrived, sorry. The plumber has arrived, the dog has barked. I think the thing there is, what can funds do? A lot depends on size. There's no doubt in the super industry, we're bulking up, we're scaling up. There's still a lot of very tiny funds. They can't have any influence on major corporations. I think the bigger we are, the more we ally with other groups, and we are now doing that through some of the agencies we're working with, we can start to make a difference, I believe. So that's certainly something I want to do. I also chair the Toowoomba Catholic Schools Council, and one of the initiatives of the council was to ask the director and his staff to develop a sustainability policy and document, and we've just finalised that. So I think that was we're a governance body. Normally, most governance bodies rely on the management to provide them with information, and that's the way it should be. But this was actually something where we did ask specifically, was there a sustainability document? The answer was, while there was a range of stuff around environmental policies and teaching and resources, no, there needed to be a policy in this area, and we asked for it to be developed.
Oh, that's great, David. I'll talk to Pat and Ken about that then. Listen, thank you so much, David and Kirsty and Alice, for your time today. It's been wonderful, and for our audience, thank you for attending. We're sort of hovering around that 80 the whole time, and there's lots of questions there that we'll keep. We can't answer them all, but I'll get back to the people individually on there. I'd just like to thank you once again. We're right on time, and these recordings will be available after next weekend. Next week, we have an international youth gathering with students from Russia, 3 different towns, 3 different cities in Russia, 2 different towns in Uganda, Valletta in Malta, and 1 school in Poland, plus New Zealand and Australia. And we're still trying to see how our Pacific partners are working. So it's an international dialogue. And then on Wednesday, 10 a.m., we have our closing, I guess, prayer and reflection. And after that will be a dialogue for people to chat backwards and forwards about their convocation. So thank you for our panel once again, and thank you for all the attendees. Have a lovely day.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye.